You can't fix a dead jet with a ghost story." The words cut through the dry afternoon air as Ryan Carter slammed his wrench against the landing gear, the metallic clang echoing across the tarmac like a verdict already passed. The fighter jet sat motionless under the harsh Texas sun, heat rippling off its steel skin in wavering lines, its canopy reflecting a sky too clear for failure. 8 engineers stood around it in crisp uniforms and stained gloves, their tablets glowing with diagnostic screens that all said the same thing: everything was fine. And yet, nothing worked. The engine refused to turn, refused to even cough, as if the machine itself had decided it was done listening to anyone in this place. A countdown clock ticked down from 40 minutes on a portable display near the command vehicle, each second a quiet hammer striking against the pride of every man standing there. "We've run every check twice," one engineer muttered, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. "Fuel lines, ignition, software, redundancies, it's clean across the board." Ryan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Then why is it sitting there like a museum piece?" No one answered. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, until it was broken by a low murmur from the edge of the runway. Someone had arrived. At first, no one paid attention. The figure didn't fit the urgency of the moment. He walked slowly, deliberately, as if time moved differently for him. A faded olive jacket hung loosely over his frame, sleeves worn soft from years of use, and his boots carried dust that didn't belong to this base. His hair was white, cut short, his posture slightly stooped, but there was nothing uncertain about the way he looked at the aircraft. His eyes didn't scan it like a checklist. They studied it like a memory. Lieutenant Mason Brooks noticed him first, stepping forward with a frown. "Sir, this is a restricted area," he said, his tone clipped, rehearsed authority wrapped around thin patience. The old man didn't answer right away. He just kept looking at the jet, at the intake, at the panel seams, at the subtle shimmer of heat bending the air around it. "General Vale asked for me," he said finally, his voice low, rough, like gravel shifting under weight. Ryan turned, catching the exchange, and let out a short laugh. That carried no humor. "You've got to be kidding me." He walked over, arms crossed, sizing the man up with a glance that dismissed him before it finished. "This is what command sends when 8 certified engineers can't solve it." A few of the others chuckled, the tension twisting into something sharper, something defensive. "What are you, some kind of retired mechanic?" Ryan added, tilting his head. "Because this isn't the 70s. This jet runs on systems you wouldn't even recognize." The old man finally shifted his gaze from the aircraft to Ryan, and for a moment, something in that look made the younger man pause without understanding why. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even challenge. It was something deeper. Something settled. "Maybe," the old man said quietly, "it's not the systems that are the problem." The wind moved across the runway, tugging at loose fabric, rattling a distant piece of equipment, and somewhere in that sound, faint and almost lost, there was something else, a subtle, uneven whisper from within the jet itself, a rhythm just slightly off, like a heartbeat no one else had noticed. Ryan scoffed, turning back toward the aircraft. "Yeah," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "and maybe you can bring it back to life with a lucky guess." The laughter came easier this time, louder, but it didn't carry far. Because the old man had already taken a step closer to the jet, his eyes narrowing slightly as if the machine had just said something only he could hear. Ryan watched him step closer with a slow disbelief that quickly turned into irritation, the kind that came from pressure he could not control and pride he refused to lose, and he moved to intercept, boots grinding against the hot concrete, but something in the way the old man stopped just short of the intake made him hesitate again, not out of respect but out of confusion, because Ethan Cole did not reach for anything, did not touch the aircraft. He simply stood there, head slightly tilted, as if he were listening to something buried beneath layers of metal and code, and the engineers exchanged glances, the earlier laughter fading into something tighter, something less certain. "You are not seriously going to let him stand there like he is hearing voices," one of them muttered, forcing a grin that did not quite land, while Lieutenant Brooks crossed his arms, trying to reassert control over a situation that was slipping into something he did not understand. "Sir, if you have something to contribute, now would be the time," he said, but Ethan did not respond to the words, his attention fixed on a small section near the forward panel, just below a seam that looked perfectly aligned, too perfect. Like a line drawn by a machine that trusted its own precision more than reality, and then, slowly, he took another step. The movement deliberate, measured, and the wind shifted across the runway, carrying with it the faint scent of heated metal and jet fuel, and that subtle, uneven whisper came again, almost lost beneath the distant hum of generators and the ticking countdown clock, but it was there, a rhythm that did not belong, and Ethan's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in doubt, but in recognition. "What are you looking at?" Ryan asked, sharper now, the edge in his voice returning as his control slipped further, and Ethan finally spoke, still not looking at him. "Something that does not match," he said quietly, and Ryan let out a short, incredulous breath, gesturing toward the open diagnostic tablet nearby. "Everything matches, that is the problem, every system is green, every check passes, that jet should be flying right now," and Ethan nodded once, almost to himself. "That is exactly why it is not," he said, and the words landed in the space between them with a weight that no one immediately responded to, because it challenged something deeper than the situation. It challenged the assumption that perfection on a screen meant truth in the real world, and one of the younger engineers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the panel Ethan had been watching. "We already checked that section," he said quickly, as if to defend the work they had done. "Torque is within spec, seal is intact, sensors behind it show no deviation." And Ethan finally crouched slightly, not with strain, but with familiarity, like a man returning to something he had done 1,000 times before, and he reached into the inside pocket of his worn jacket, pulling out a small leather pouch, the surface cracked and darkened with age, the edges softened by years of handling, and Ryan shook his head, a disbelieving smile creeping back in. "You have got to be kidding me," he said, louder now, drawing the attention of the others again. "What is that supposed to do? Fix a 5th-generation fighter with a pocket toolkit?" But Ethan did not answer. He simply held the pouch for a moment, his thumb brushing across the worn snap, and for a brief second, the noise of the runway seemed to fall away from him, replaced by something only he could hear, a memory not loud but precise, like a pattern etched into his mind. And when he looked back up, the jet was no longer just a machine in front of him. It was something familiar, something he had known long before any of these men had ever touched a control panel, and without another word, he moved his hand toward that perfectly aligned seam, while behind him, Airman Jake Nolan stood frozen, a strange unease settling in his chest, because for the first time that day, it felt like someone was not guessing anymore, it felt like someone already knew. Ryan stepped forward the moment Ethan's fingers hovered near the panel, his hand shooting out instinctively as if to stop him, but he paused just inches away, caught between authority and uncertainty, because there was something unsettling about the old man's calm, something that made interruption feel like a mistake he could not explain. "Do not touch that," Ryan said, forcing the command back into his voice, louder now, sharper, as if volume alone could restore control. "That panel is sealed and calibrated, breaking it will set us back hours." But Ethan did not flinch, did not even acknowledge the warning in the way Ryan expected. Instead his fingers rested lightly against the metal, not pressing, not forcing, just feeling, tracing along the seam with a slow precision that looked almost out of place in a world of digital readouts and automated diagnostics. And for a moment nothing happened. The wind passed. The countdown clock ticked down to 31 minutes, and somewhere behind them a generator hummed steadily, grounding the scene in the present, until Ethan spoke again, softer this time, almost to the machine itself. "You are too tight," he murmured, and Ryan frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "What does that even mean?" he demanded, but Ethan did not answer directly. Instead he shifted his hand slightly, tapping once, then twice, each touch measured, listening again, and the faint uneven whisper returned, clearer now to him than before, and in that sound something aligned in his mind, not data, not numbers, but memory, and for the briefest instant the bright Texas runway dissolved into something else, not a different place in space, but a different place in time, where heat and noise carried a different weight, where machines were not just systems but lifelines, and he had learned to read them without screens, without confirmation, just instinct and consequence. And when the present returned, his expression had not changed, but something behind his eyes had settled into certainty. "It is not broken," he said, finally looking at Ryan. "It is being told to stay silent," and the engineers exchanged looks, the statement hanging in the air like something that should have been dismissed but could not be ignored. "That is not how it works," one of them said quickly, almost defensively. Systems do not just decide that, and Ethan gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. No, he agreed, they do not, and then he reached for the edge of the panel, not forcing it open, but applying just enough pressure to shift it slightly, a movement so subtle it would not register on any diagnostic system, but enough to break the illusion of perfect alignment, and a faint click followed, barely audible, but real, and Ryan's expression tightened, because that sound had not been part of any test they had run. "What did you just do?" he asked, stepping closer. Now, unable to stay back any longer, and Ethan straightened slowly, his hand dropping back to his side. "I listened," he said simply, and behind them, Airman Jake Nolan felt something shift in his chest, a quiet realization that the situation had moved beyond anything he had been trained for, because the confidence in the old man's voice was not arrogance, it was recognition, and without thinking, Jake stepped back, pulling out his phone with a hesitation that lasted only a second before his thumb began to move, dialing a number he was not supposed to use, his voice low as he turned away from the group. "Sir, you need to hear this," he said when the line connected. While on the runway, the engineers stood in a silence that no one had planned for, watching a man they had already dismissed as he looked at the aircraft. Not like a problem to solve, but like something that had been waiting for him all along. The faint click lingered in the air longer than it should have, not because of its volume, but because of what it implied, and Ryan felt it before he understood it, a subtle shift in control that no system log could explain. "That does not prove anything," he said quickly, stepping closer to the panel as if proximity alone could restore authority. "You moved a plate, that is it. The diagnostics are still clean." But even as he spoke, his eyes flicked toward the tablet again, searching for confirmation, for something that would re-establish the certainty he had been relying on all day, and for the first time, there was a hesitation in his posture, small but visible, because certainty was beginning to fracture under something he could not measure, while Ethan had already turned his attention back to the aircraft, his hand hovering again, not rushing, not forcing, just waiting for the right moment, as if the machine itself would tell him when to move, and the wind shifted once more, brushing across the runway, carrying that uneven whisper again, slightly clearer now, no longer buried, and Ethan exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, before reaching back into the leather pouch and pulling out a small, worn tool, its edges smoothed by years of use, its purpose not immediately obvious to anyone watching. "You are not seriously going to use that," Ryan said, his voice tightening again, the earlier confidence now edged with something else, something closer to unease. "This is not some old airframe. You cannot just improvise on a platform like this," and a few of the engineers nodded, eager to anchor themselves back to rules and procedures, to the safety of what they knew. But Ethan did not argue, he did not defend, he simply moved, positioning the tool against the panel with a precision that suggested familiarity far deeper than any manual could provide, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow, the ticking clock, the distant hum, even the shifting of boots on concrete, as he applied a small, deliberate adjustment, not forceful, not dramatic, just enough to change something invisible, and then he stopped, listening again, and this time, the whisper changed, subtly, but unmistakably, the uneven rhythm smoothing into something closer to balance, and Ethan nodded once, almost to himself, as if a question had just been answered. "What did you change?" Lieutenant Brooks asked, his voice lower now, no longer commanding, but searching, and Ethan straightened, slipping the tool back into the pouch without ceremony. "Nothing that your system would recognize," he said, and the words landed with a quiet weight that no one challenged immediately, because they felt true in a way that logic alone could not dismiss, and behind them, Airman Jake's voice remained low into the phone, urgent but controlled. "Yes sir, he is already working on it." "No sir, not using any standard procedure." He paused, listening, his eyes widening slightly as the response came through. "Understood," he said, ending the call with a hand that no longer felt steady, and as he turned back toward the group, something had changed in his expression, a seriousness that had not been there before. While on the runway, Ryan took a step back without realizing it, creating space where there had been resistance just moments earlier, and Ethan placed his hand lightly against the aircraft once more, not as a mechanic, not as an engineer, but as someone who understood that machines, no matter how advanced, still carried echoes of the hands that built them, and as the silence stretched, heavy and expectant, the jet sat there no longer like a problem waiting to be solved, but like something on the edge of waking, waiting for the one person who knew how to ask it the right way. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, the kind that settled into the bones of everyone standing there, and Ryan felt it pressing in on him, pushing against the confidence he had been holding onto all morning. "All right," he said finally, forcing a breath out as he stepped toward the cockpit ladder. "Let us end this." His voice carried an edge now, not mocking, not quite, but defensive, as if proving the machine was still dead would restore everything that had slipped. And he climbed up quickly, sliding into the seat with practiced familiarity, his hands moving over the controls in a sequence he could have performed blindfolded. "External power is still connected," one of the engineers called out, eager to re-establish procedure, to anchor the moment back into something predictable, and Ryan nodded, flipping switches with precise movements, the cockpit coming alive. With soft beeps and indicator lights, screens flickering to life in a controlled cascade of systems booting in sequence, and for a moment, everything looked normal again, the way it should have looked from the beginning, and Ryan allowed himself a small exhale, a flicker of relief returning, until he reached the final command, the one that had failed every time before, and he hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before engaging it, and the jet responded exactly as it had all day, a hollow, incomplete attempt, a system acknowledging the command but refusing to follow through, and the sound died almost as soon as it began, leaving behind that same empty silence, heavier now, more final, and Ryan sat there for a moment, staring at the panel as if willing it to change, before exhaling sharply and pulling his hands back. "Nothing," he said, louder than necessary, as if announcing it would make it less personal, and he climbed down, boots hitting the concrete harder than before. "We are done wasting time," he added, looking directly at Ethan now, the earlier hesitation replaced by frustration. "You moved a panel, you tapped the airframe, and nothing changed," but even as he said it, there was something missing from the certainty, something he could not quite bring himself to believe completely anymore, and Ethan did not respond immediately. He simply watched the aircraft, his gaze steady, patient, as if the result had already been expected. "You asked it the wrong way," he said after a moment, and Ryan let out a short, incredulous laugh, though it came thinner this time, less convincing. "It is a machine," he replied, spreading his hand slightly. "It does not care how you ask," and Ethan gave a small nod, not disagreeing, but not conceding either. "No," he said quietly, "but it responds to what you miss," and the words lingered, unsettling in their simplicity, and before Ryan could answer, Ethan stepped forward again, moving past him without force, without urgency, just with a quiet inevitability that made no one try to stop him this time, and he placed his hand once more against the aircraft, near the same seam, feeling for that now steadier rhythm beneath the surface, and then he turned slightly toward the cockpit, not climbing in, not taking control, but simply positioning himself where the sound carried best, and he nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "Try again," he said, and this time, it was not a suggestion, it was a statement, and Ryan hesitated, the command hanging in the air between them, because something had shifted in a way he could not explain, the certainty of failure no longer absolute, and behind them, Airman Jake Nolan watched with a tightening chest, his mind replaying the voice on the other end of the call, the sudden urgency, the unmistakable change in tone when the name Ethan Cole had been spoken, and as the countdown clock dropped below 20 minutes, the entire runway seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a result that no longer felt predictable, waiting to see if the old man who spoke to machines like memories was about to prove something none of them were ready to understand. Ryan did not move at first, his hands resting against the edge of the cockpit as if the metal itself might give him an answer he was no longer certain he understood, and the old man's words lingered in the air, simple, direct, impossible to categorize within the systems he trusted. "Try again," and this time there was no laughter left to cover the hesitation, no easy dismissal to fall back on. Just the quiet weight of a moment that had shifted beyond logic, and slowly, almost reluctantly, Ryan turned back toward the controls, climbing into the seat once more, his movements less certain now, not because he had forgotten the procedure, but because something about it no longer felt complete on its own, and as he settled in, he glanced down at the instrument panel, the screens glowing with the same perfect data, every indicator steady, every system reporting readiness, and for the first time that day, that perfection did not reassure him. It unsettled him, because it no longer matched what he was seeing unfold just a few feet away, and outside, Ethan stood with one hand lightly against the aircraft, his head angled slightly, as if he were still listening, still aligning something invisible, and the wind moved again, softer now, brushing across the runway, carrying that steadier rhythm that had replaced the earlier imbalance, and Ethan gave the faintest nod, not to Ryan, not to anyone, but to the machine itself. And Ryan saw it, and something in that small motion pushed him forward, past doubt, past pride, into action, and he reached for the controls again, repeating the sequence with careful precision, each switch, each command, exactly as before, but this time there was a difference he could not name, a subtle shift in the way he moved, less forceful, less certain of outcome, but more attentive, as if he were waiting for the aircraft to respond instead of demanding that it obey, and when he reached the final command, the one that had failed every time, he paused again, longer this time. The seconds stretching as the countdown clock dipped below 15 minutes, and then he engaged it, and for a brief moment, nothing happened, the same hollow silence threatening to return, the same failure ready to repeat itself, and then something changed, not dramatically, not instantly, but subtly, a low vibration beginning deep within the frame, faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the background hum of the bass, but growing, steady, controlled, and Ryan froze, his hand still on the control as he felt it through the seat, through the structure of the jet itself, and outside, the engineers leaned forward without realizing it, their attention pulled toward the aircraft in a way it had not been all day, because this was different, this was not the abrupt failure they had come to expect, this was something building, something aligning, and the sound followed, not loud, not yet, but real, a rising tone that carried through the intake and out across the runway, and Ethan stepped back slightly, removing his hand from the aircraft, his work done without announcement, without explanation, and as the engine continued to come alive, the hesitation that had defined the entire day began to dissolve, replaced by a realization that none of them could fully articulate, because the machine had not been forced into operation, it had been guided there, and Ryan sat in the cockpit, staring at the instruments as they responded in perfect sequence, every system now not just reporting readiness, but proving it, and for the first time, he did not feel relief, he felt something else, something quieter, heavier, the understanding that everything he had relied on had not been wrong, but it had not been enough, and on the runway, as the sound of the engine grew stronger, filling the air with a controlled, undeniable presence, the engineers who had laughed only minutes before stood in complete silence, watching a man who had never raised his voice, never defended himself, and had just done something none of them had been able to do, without ever once trying to prove that he could. The engine did not just start, it settled into a rhythm that felt intentional, a smooth, controlled rise that filled the runway with a low, steady power, and no one spoke as the sound grew, because there was nothing left to say that would not break the moment, and Ryan remained frozen in the cockpit, his hands hovering just above the controls as the instruments responded in perfect harmony, every gauge aligning, every system confirming what should have been impossible just minutes before, and outside, the engineers stood in a loose formation, no longer a team solving a problem, but witnesses to something they could not fully explain, their earlier confidence replaced by a quiet, uneasy respect, and Ethan had already stepped back several feet, his hands resting at his sides, his gaze no longer fixed on the aircraft, but somewhere beyond it, as if the outcome had never been in question for him. And Airman Jake Nolan felt his phone vibrate in his hand, the call returning sooner than expected, and he answered quickly, turning slightly away from the others. "Sir," he said, keeping his voice low despite the rising engine noise, and the response on the other end was immediate, sharp, focused. "Is it running?" the voice asked, and Jake swallowed, glancing back at the jet, at the steady rotation, the unmistakable confirmation of life. "Yes, sir, it is fully stable," he replied, and there was a brief pause, not of confusion, but of recognition, as if the outcome had confirmed something already known. "Do not let him leave," the voice said, calm but absolute, and the line went dead, and Jake lowered the phone slowly, his eyes shifting toward Ethan with a new understanding that settled heavily in his chest, because this was no longer just about a machine being fixed, this was about something much larger moving into place, and on the runway, Ryan finally moved, pulling his hands back from the controls as if the aircraft no longer needed him in the same way, and he climbed down from the cockpit ladder more slowly than before, his boots hitting the ground without the earlier force, his posture changed in a way he could not quite articulate, and he looked at Ethan, really looked this time, not as an obstacle, not as an outsider, but as someone who had just revealed a gap in everything he thought he understood. "How did you know?" Ryan asked, the question coming out quieter than he intended, stripped of challenge, stripped of pride, and Ethan met his gaze for a moment, his expression calm, unchanged. "It told me," he said simply, and Ryan frowned slightly, not dismissing it this time, but trying to understand it, to fit it into a framework that no longer felt complete, and behind them, Lieutenant Brooks straightened, his authority returning in form if not in certainty. "We need to document what just happened," he said, though even he seemed unsure what that would mean, and one of the engineers shook his head slowly. "I still fixed on the jet. There is nothing in the system logs," he murmured, almost to himself. "No fault. No correction, nothing changed, and that." Realization hung in the air, heavier than any failure had been, because it meant the solution had existed entirely outside the tools they trusted, and as the engine continued to hum steadily, no longer a problem, no longer a question, the sound became something else, a quiet confirmation that the old man had not fixed the aircraft in the way they understood fixing. He had simply brought it back to where it was supposed to be, and in that moment, the distance between experience and knowledge, between memory and data, became impossible to ignore, and no one laughed, no one spoke out of turn, because the balance of the entire situation had shifted, not with force, not with argument, but with a single action that none of them could replicate, and standing there on the sunlit runway, surrounded by machines and measurements and certainty, they found themselves facing something that did not fit any of it, something quieter, older, and far more precise than anything they had been trained to trust. The sound of the engine continued to build until it filled the entire runway, not overwhelming, but undeniable, a steady presence that pressed against the chest and settled into the ground beneath their boots, and in the distance, beyond the heat shimmer and the line of support vehicles, a convoy appeared, dark silhouettes moving with purpose across the access road, their approach cutting through the moment with a different kind of weight. And Airman Jake Nolan saw them first, his posture tightening instinctively as recognition set in before confirmation. "Sir," he said under his breath, though no one had asked, and heads began to turn one by one, the engineers shifting their attention away from the aircraft for the first time since it had come alive, and Ryan followed their gaze, his expression changing again. Not confusion this time, but realization, because the vehicles were not standard base traffic, their movement too direct, too deliberate, and they rolled to a controlled stop at the edge of the tarmac, doors opening almost in unison, and the man who stepped out first did not need introduction, even from a distance, his presence carried it for him. General Harrison Vale moved forward with a pace that was not rushed, but left no room for interruption, his uniform sharp, his posture exact, and the air itself seemed to shift. As he approached, conversations that had not even begun fell away before they could form, and Lieutenant Brooks straightened instantly, stepping forward with a salute that came a fraction too late. "General," he began, but the words did not continue, because Vale had already passed him, his focus locked ahead, and Ryan felt it as the general's attention moved across the scene, not scanning, not assessing in the usual way, but searching for something specific, and then it stopped, landing on Ethan Cole, standing just off to the side, as if he had never been at the center of anything, and for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, the two men simply looked at each other, and something passed between them that no one else could see, something built on recognition, not introduction, and the engine continued to hum behind them, steady, controlled, almost secondary now to what was unfolding, and Ryan found himself stepping back without realizing it, the same instinct mirrored by the others, space opening around Ethan not because he demanded it, but because it felt necessary, and General Vale closed the final distance, stopping just a few feet away, his expression unreadable, but not neutral, something deeper held beneath the surface, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, carrying across the quiet runway with absolute clarity. "I was told a jet that could not start is now running," he said, and no one answered, because the answer was already there, vibrating through the air around them, and his gaze did not leave Ethan as he continued, "And I was told you were the one who touched it," and Ethan did not move, did not shift, he simply met the general's eyes with the same quiet steadiness he had carried all along, and for a brief moment, the entire base seemed to pause around them. The countdown clock still ticking somewhere behind, the engine still running, but none of it mattered in the same way anymore, because whatever was about to happen next was not about the aircraft, it was about something far older than the machine itself, something that had just been recognized by the only person there who understood exactly what it meant. The question lingered between them, not because it demanded an answer, but because it carried a weight that only one of them truly understood, and Ethan Cole did not rush to fill the silence, he simply stood there, the steady hum of the engine behind him reflecting in the stillness of his posture, and General Harrison Vale studied him for a moment longer before something in his expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The kind of change that did not come from uncertainty, but from confirmation, and without another word, the general took one step forward and raised his hand in a precise, deliberate motion, a formal salute held with absolute respect, and the effect was immediate, like a ripple moving through the air, because no one had expected it, not Ryan, not Lieutenant Brooks, not any of the engineers who had stood there minutes earlier with laughter still in their voices, and for a fraction of a second, no one moved, their minds struggling to reconcile what they were seeing, until instinct took over, and one by one, then all at once, every uniformed figure on that runway straightened and followed, salute snapping into place with a sharpness that cut through the steady engine noise, and Ryan felt his own hand rise without thought, his posture aligning with something deeper than training, something that had been absent until this moment, and Ethan did not return the gesture immediately, not out of hesitation, but because he had never needed to claim it, and when he finally did, it was simple. Understated, a quiet acknowledgement rather than a display, and the silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before, because it was no longer filled with doubt or tension, but with understanding, and General Vale lowered his hand slowly, his voice carrying across the line of salutes with calm authority. "You kept them flying when the system said they should not," he said, and though the words were directed at Ethan, they reached everyone standing there, because they reframed everything they had just witnessed, not as a trick, not as an anomaly, but as something rooted in experience that could not be replicated by software or procedure, and Ryan lowered his hand a moment later, his gaze fixed on Ethan, the earlier arrogance gone completely now, replaced by something quieter, something more difficult to admit, and he took a step forward, stopping just short of where the old man stood. "Sir," he said, the word coming naturally this time, not forced, not formal, but earned, and Ethan gave the faintest nod, as if acknowledging not the title, but the change behind it, and around them, the runway returned slowly to motion, personnel shifting, the countdown clock forgotten, the demonstration no longer the priority, because the real event had already taken place, and the fighter jet continued to run, steady and alive, not as a victory, not as a spectacle, but as a reminder, and as the general turned slightly, giving quiet instructions to his aides, ensuring that nothing about this moment would be dismissed or overlooked, Ethan stepped back once more, returning to the edge of the scene where he had always been most comfortable, his presence no longer questioned, no longer challenged, and as he began to walk away, unhurried, unnoticed by some but not by those who understood, the sound of the engine followed him, not loudly, but steadily, like a quiet echo of something that did not need recognition to exist, and Ryan watched him go, the weight of the moment settling fully now, because what had happened on that runway could not be logged, could not be measured, and could not be taught in the way he had been taught everything else, and for the first time, he understood that not all knowledge came from systems, and not all mastery needed to be proven, some of it simply existed, waiting for the moment when it was needed, and as the sun hung high over the base and the air shimmered with heat and quiet respect, the lesson remained, unspoken but unmistakable, that some men do not fix machines to show what they know, they fix them because they remember what it means when they do not work.